What is going on, everyone? My name is Anson, and we're back with a brand new video. In this video, I'm going to be teaching you all the basics of Next.js. Now, I have some slides prepared for you all. If you don't want to go through the slides, do not worry. I will leave timestamps so you'll know where to skip to just get into the coding of this tutorial. But if you want to stick around and watch the slides and understand better what exactly Next.js is, why you should use it, and also understand what's server-side rendering, what's static site generation, what is pre-rendering, and a bunch of other terminologies that you might have heard of with Next.js, definitely watch these slides. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So what exactly is Next.js? Well, Next.js is a React framework that provides built-in support for server-side rendering, static site generation, and it also provides a bunch of other features such as a built-in routing system. So you don't need to use something like React Router anymore. You can just use the built-in routing system that's based off of the way that you structure your files. And we'll take a look at that when we actually get to the Next.js project. And there's also plenty of other features too that comes with Next.js that you would normally need to depend on a third-party library. So one thing that I should note is that when you are using Next.js, you're actually not using a new language, you're not using any new syntax. The same way that you write your React components is the same way that you would write React components in Next.js. Like I said, Next is literally a React framework. Okay, so you're still writing React code, you're still writing JSX, TSX, in Next.js. Okay, the only difference is that with Next.js, it takes care of rendering your pages on the server side. Okay, and we'll talk more about what exactly is server-side rendering later, and it's actually very important to understand what exactly server-side rendering is. Okay, because that is actually one huge thing many people consider when they want to use Next.js over something like Create React app or just regular client-side generation frameworks or client-side generation based frameworks. Okay, so what are some reasons to use Next.js? Well, the number one reason is, of course, server-side rendering. There's also SEO. So SEO stands for search engine optimization. We're not going to talk too much about that in this tutorial, but there are some good resources on the Next.js docs that explain what exactly is SEO, why it's important. But in short, SEO basically makes it so that when you have a page that is SEO performant, it will rank higher on search engines. Basically, search engines will be able to crawl through the web, they will be able to index your pages, and it'll rank your page higher compared to other pages, depending on lots of different factors. Okay, so if you want your page to appear higher on search engines, you want to make sure it is SEO performant. So this is really great if you're building blogging platforms, for example. Okay, Next.js is also very fast. As I mentioned earlier, if you want like a fast initial page load, which is, for example, if you want to build out a landing page that loads very fast for your customers, that is one good reason to use Next.js because of the server-side rendering feature that's built in. Okay, and the reason why it's faster for the initial page load is because all of the rendering already happens on the server side. All of the HTML generation occurs on the server side. Once the HTML has been generated, it's sent to the browser, the client, and the browser just has to load that document compared to regular client-side rendering. Okay, so for example, when you set up a application with Create React app, by default it uses client-side rendering. Okay, all of that JavaScript is sent to the browser, and then the JavaScript is executed to then generate all the HTML, and then it will then load up that document once it's been fully generated. And you can imagine why the initial page load is going to be a lot more faster based off of server-side rendering versus client-side rendering, because all of the HTML generation has already happened on the server side, and the browser just needs to take that single document and then just load it up in the browser, compared to the browser needing to, get the bundle from whatever server that is serving the JavaScript, and then that JavaScript needs to be executed, then it needs to generate the HTML. You can imagine why it is much more slower. Okay, and as I mentioned already, there's a file system based router with Next.js, which we'll take a look at later. There's also a built-in API layer. So let's say if you want to build a full stack application, you actually can just use the Next.js API layer. There are some disadvantages to relying entirely on the Next.js API layer. So you don't always want to use the API layer, but it is very handy, especially if you want to build out a server-sided application that you might need just for some simple tasks, such as making API calls to some external API that requires an API token, right? You want to keep that on the server side. Okay, so as I've mentioned already, we listed out some reasons to use Next.js, but some other reasons that you might consider using Next.js for is, let's say, for example, if you want to build out a platform that wants to serve content fast. So for example, if you're building out a blogging platform, if you're building out a platform to, write technical tutorials such as, programming tutorials, it doesn't even have to be programming related, right? Just anything that has to deal with serving content. Okay, could be, a cookbook, recipes for dishes, could be really anything. Okay, and you also want these pages to rank higher on search engines. So these are, reasons to consider using Next.js. Fast initial loading page. So if you have a marketing page that you want to load very fast, Next.js is very good for that. Because like I said, all of the HTML generation already happens on the server side. Okay, and also another reason to use Next.js, as I've mentioned before, maybe you need to use an API layer, but you don't want to set up a new backend using an Express instance or Nest.js framework. Okay, so instead of just having two separate code bases, which might not even be necessary, but depending on the type of project you're building, you can just set up the API routes with Next.js. Okay, so now that we've mentioned all of the basics of Next.js, what are some reasons to use it? Now, how can we actually learn Next.js? Well, the first thing is to make sure you have understanding of React, make sure you have learned React already. I would also say make sure you have also built an application with React, maybe one or two, before moving on to Next.js. If you haven't already done this, please make sure you definitely learn React. Okay, so must-haves. I would say you need to definitely understand server-side rendering, static-side generation, and client-side rendering. If you don't understand these three concepts, it's going to give you lots of trouble with understanding the whole purpose of Next.js. And don't worry, we will talk about these three topics in the next couple of slides. And also you need to understand what exactly pre-rendering is. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk about what exactly server-side rendering, static-side generation, and client-side rendering is. All right, so core concepts. So the first thing that we need to understand is the way that Next.js handles rendering for our pages that we build out. So there's a concept called pre-rendering in Next.js. And pre-rendering, all that means is that all of the HTML for each page that you build is generated on the server side. Okay, that's literally all it is, compared to a regular Create React app project that by default has client-side rendering. All of the HTML is generated on the client side. So that is not pre-rendering. Okay, so pre-rendering is good because it can increase performance of your application. And it can also improve SEO, search engine optimization, okay? And it can positively impact your application a lot, okay? We'll talk about Lighthouse tests in a separate video, but that is something that you can use to determine if your application has good SEO and good performance. So pre-rendering is actually a good thing because it can take care of generating all the HTML on the server side and then send it over to the browser to load the document. Compared to client-side rendering, like I said before, client-side rendering is where the JavaScript is executed on the client. So if you're not familiar already, typically when you build out your React app, let's say if you're using a Create React app project and you're building it for production, right? What happens is it bundles all of those assets using Webpack, and then you'll notice that there is a single JavaScript file that is imported, or not imported, but it is referenced from that index.html file in the build folder. Okay, those files are all served from some server, typically, a Nginx proxy or Apache web server, whatever server it is. And then those files are received by the client, by the browser. The browser is then going to execute all of that JavaScript, which is then going to generate all of the code all of the HTML elements on the client side. Okay, and that of course can impact the initial load of your application. And that is the reason why many people tend to yield towards Next.js when they're building landing pages, especially landing pages, campaign marketing, ads, things like that, because those need to be SEO performant. They need to have fast loading time, and they need to rank higher on search engines. Okay? All right, so now that we understand what exactly pre-rendering is, okay, let's talk about static generation. Okay, so static generation is basically just one of two forms of pre-rendering in Next.js. So there's two types of pre-rendering in Next.js. So static generation is basically when the HTML is generated during build time. Okay, and what exactly does that mean, build time? Well, it just basically means when you are ready to build your Next.js app for production and you want to serve it to customers in production, right? You want to host it on some, Amazon Web Server EC2 instance. Maybe you want to host on DigitalOcean, Droplet, wherever you want. You want to run the build script, and then once that is done, you will then serve that project in production for your customers. So that is when all of the generation of the HTML occurs. And that HTML is served to the clients upon each request. So what this means is that the HTML is generated literally one time during build, and that same HTML is going to be sent to the client every single time. Okay, so let's say, for example, if your JavaScript logic fetches an external API or a database that may update over time, the generated HTML that occurs during build time will actually have the data from the source that was provided at the time, and it will never update. Okay, so let's say, for example, your database currently has 2 users, right? And when you generate all the HTML during build time, maybe your React code is responsible for fetching all the users from the database, and it's going to render 2 users, right? The 2 from the database, right? Well, when you build the application, both of those users will be rendered, because during the build time it will call all the functions, and those functions could take care of calling APIs, calling a database, whatever it's doing. Okay, whatever data is returned from the source is going to then be used however you want to use it. Okay, now if that data is updated from the external source, such as the database or the external API, nothing happens because the HTML has already been generated. Okay, so you can imagine that there are some pros and cons with this. Okay, now this is obviously good for applications that don't change often. So if you're building a blogging platform that is rarely ever going to change, maybe you might notice, an error in your grammar, 6 months after you publish it. Not a big deal. Make the change, build the application again, let all the HTML generate statically, and then serve it to the customers again. Okay, and upon each request, that same HTML that was generated during build time from, let's say, either right now or 6 months ago or 1 year ago, it'll still be the same HTML. It never changes. It'll be sent upon each request. Okay, it's also good for landing pages too, portfolio websites, blogs, etc. Okay, now of course, these types of applications, if you need dynamic data, like if you need data that is going to change over time to be displayed to the user, then static generation is obviously not the right way to go about, right? Because if the API has data that updates a lot and you want to actually serve that to the user, it's not a good reason to use static generation, because then it'll show old information to the customers. And that brings us to the second form of pre-rendering, which is server-side rendering. And what exactly is server-side rendering? Well, we had a little brief introduction to server-side rendering, but now let's talk a little bit more about it, so that way we better understand what exactly server-side rendering is. So, server-side rendering, and we're going to call it SSR for short. All server-side rendering is where the HTML is generated on each request. So every single time you make a request to the server, okay, the HTML is going to be generated over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, so this is good if you have applications that have data that are changing constantly. You want to consider using server-side rendering over static generation. The reason why is obvious, right? Because if you have lots of data changing, but if you use static generation, you're only going to have data from the source that was generated during build time, but it's going to probably go stale within like seconds. So for example, an e-commerce application, right? A lot of times you will change the product listing. You might upload new images. You might change the description. You might change a lot of different things. You might not want to consider only using static site generation, but server-side rendering. Okay, so as I mentioned before, server-side rendering is great for a lot of the other applications that we mentioned in the previous slide where we talked about landing pages, portfolio websites, blogs, etc. The only difference is that server-side rendering just generates the HTML again upon each request. So it's up to you to determine how your data changes, and based off of that reasoning, should you pick static generation or should you pick server-side rendering? Okay, so these two types of pre-rendering fits well with the same types of application. Just depends on how you want to use it. Okay, so let's move on. So one thing that I should also mention is that these concepts are not tailored specifically to Next.js. A lot of the concepts that you're learning in these slides are transferable to other frameworks, other tools. So don't worry, because someday someone might make a brand new framework that does things better compared to Next.js. So learning these concepts right now is actually really important and really good, and it's not a waste of your time. Okay, one more thing that I should also bring up is there's actually something called incremental static regeneration, and this basically just allows you to just regenerate the HTML based off of changes. Okay, so if you want static pages but you don't want to generate the HTML upon each request, but you do want to do it sometimes, you can use incremental static regeneration. We're not going to talk too much about that, but if you just visit this link right over here, this is the official Next.js docs. They have a section that talks about incremental static regeneration. I figured I would mention that in this slides because some of you might be wondering about that. Okay, now one more thing that we need to, of course, go in depth on is client-side rendering. As I've mentioned already, client-side rendering is the opposite of server-side rendering, right? All it means is the rendering, all of the HTML generation just happens on the client side, on the browser side, rather than on the server side. Okay, so one good example, and this is the reason why we need to understand the difference between client side versus server side rendering, is because I've seen a lot of people who use Next.js, instead of using the Next.js functions to actually take care of data fetching, they actually use the useEffect hook, and then they use some HTTP library to fetch data. That is not the way to do it if you want to use server-side rendering or take advantage of server-side rendering, because with the useEffect hook, you're basically waiting for the entire component to mount. So basically, by that time, all of the HTML has already been generated already. Then you're fetching the data. That's not server-side rendering. Okay, so this is the reason why I need to stress out these concepts, because if you don't understand it, you're going to use Next.js the wrong way. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much it. So a lot of the stuff already I've mentioned already. I will leave a link in the description to these slides if you guys want to go over it. Okay, but yeah. So one thing that I should also mention before we even get started into coding is that a lot of people also do tend to choose Next.js blindly without really understanding its main purposes. So to finalize everything, when should you choose a framework like Next.js over just regular Create React app, or even just using a build tool like Vite to create React apps? Well, you want to use Next.js when you want to take advantage of its server-side rendering, static site generation. You want your initial page to load really fast. You want great SEO. And if your application also does not have much user interaction, so if you don't have like complicated user interfaces, if you don't have complex, state, if you don't have complex components, right? Service rendering with Next.js would be great. Okay, but if you have an application that does not need any SEO at all, you don't really care about SEO, the application itself is going to require authentication. It doesn't really matter if it ranks higher on pages or not. Okay. All right, so that is all we have with the slides. I know it took about 20 minutes, but it's important that I mention all of these concepts, all of these terminologies, because it's going to really help you out a lot with understanding what exactly the purpose of Next.js is for. Okay, so hopefully you all enjoyed this mini part of the whole tutorial. So we're going to move on to the second part of this course, where we actually set up a Next.js project, and we'll just walk through the file structure of the Next.js application, and then I'll just give you guys all a quick little crash course of how exactly Next.js works and how you can actually do stuff in Next.js. So let's go ahead and get started with that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead into my terminal, and I'm going to go ahead and create a Next.js project. So if you use npm as your package manager, then all you need to do is just use the npx command and just do create next app, and you can just do @latest to get the latest version. Okay. Now, if you use yarn, you can just do yarn create next app. Okay, same exact thing. Okay, if you use pnpm, so that's just pnpm create next app. Okay, now I personally use yarn, so I'll just do yarn create next app. Now, let's say, for example, if you prefer using TypeScript, you can also use the -- TypeScript flag. For this tutorial, I'm not going to be using TypeScript because I want to make sure that everyone understands Next.js, and a lot of you might not be familiar with TypeScript, so I'm not going to add that overhead for you all. So we'll just use regular JavaScript. Okay, so let's just go ahead and hit enter. And it's going to ask us to give ourselves a project name. I'm just going to call this Next.js tutorial. And it should not take that long to generate our files for our project. Okay, now that that's done, let's see the into Next.js tutorial. And you can see, yeah, we have all of our files created. I'll go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. So I have my Visual Studio Code open up right now, and let's go ahead and explore the project files before we even do anything else. Okay, so let's start from the root directory. Let me zoom in just a little bit. So you can see that we have some pretty self-explanatory files. Don't really need to go through every single one. We have the yarn.lock file because we're using yarn. We have the readme. Okay, we have a package.json file, so you can see all of the dependencies. You can see all of the scripts. Okay, we have our next.config.js file. So this file itself, you're going to be using to configure anything that has to do with Next.js itself, and also with the way that you want to run the application. So we'll talk more about this file later on when we get to it. Okay, but if you ever need to configure certain things, you'll do that inside this config file. We have a getignore, we have an eslint rc.json, okay, and that just uses the next eslint plugin. We have, let's take a look at the folders now. So we have our pages folder. So this is where all of the pages that you'll create for your application, this is where you will create your pages. So as I mentioned in these slides, that Next.js has a built-in routing system. And the way that it works is when you create a page inside this pages folder, so whatever you name it is going to be the name of that route. So let's say, for example, if I were to create a new file, and if I called it dashboard.js, then Next.js will create a route for dashboard, whatever the name of the file is. Okay, and that's pretty cool. So let's just delete this. Okay. Now inside the pages folder, there is this created folder called API. It's a subfolder. And the API folder is the API layer of the entire application. This is where all of your API routes are going to go. So as I mentioned before, Next.js has a built-in API layer. So if you don't want to use a separate web framework like Express or Nest.js, or even, something like Fastify or Koa, right? You can just use the built-in Next.js API. Okay, and so this is where all of the API routes will go. And the same thing, if you wanted to create your own API endpoints, you would just name it whatever you want by creating a new file. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to create a user's endpoint for our API layer, I'll just name this file users.js, and then all you would do is just export a function inside, export a default function inside this file, and then Next.js will create the /API/users route, which will then just return whatever you want. Okay, but like I said, we will take a look at plenty of examples. Okay, we also have our index.js file. So this is just the base page, and you'll see what it'll look like when we run the app. But let's go into the _app.js file. Now this file itself is equivalent to our index.js file in a regular create React app project. So this is the root component. You can think of it like the root component, where it has all of the configurations happening. So you can see over here that it takes in this component, and any page props, it will also pass them into this component as well. So this is where all of your pages are actually really being rendered. Okay, so like I said, you can think of this file as the entry point for our application. You can even see that it has the globals.css file being imported from the styles folder, and it's basically just importing all the global CSS that we want to use across our application. Okay, so a lot of things that you'll need to configure. Let's say, for example, if you're using context API, you'll likely wrap the provider inside this function over here. Okay, so we'll get to that later though. Now we also have a public folder, so this is where you can store, public assets, images, other stuff. Right now they have, I guess, 2 icons, or vector, and I think this is a favorite icon, I think. And then we have the styles folder, so this is where you can store, your CSS. If you want to use CSS modules, or if you want to use globals, you can store them inside over here. Okay, so that's just pretty much a quick rundown of all of the files that are generated out of the box when you create a Next project. All right, so let's go ahead and actually start up the application. So you can start up the application by just running the dev script. So that'll run it in dev mode. Okay, of course, when you're ready to actually run your application for production, you want to make sure you actually build the application, and then you want to actually run the start script. So that'll actually run the production build of it. Okay, so let's go inside our terminal and we'll just run yarn dev, or if you're using npm, just do npm run dev. But I'll just do yarn dev. And you can see it already started up immediately on port 3000. So if I go ahead and if I just click here, it's going to open up the project. So let's just move this over here. And you can see, welcome to Next.js. So this page over here, all of this HTML that you see, all of it is coming from the index.js file. Okay, so the index.js file is just going to be the root page. So you can see I can go ahead and just delete all of this stuff right over here. And then all of it, whoops, let me just fix that real quick. Let me just delete all of this. Delete all of that. All right, there we go, much better. Okay, and you can see that everything is gone. Okay, pretty cool. All right, so let's go ahead and just create some pages so that way you all can see how the built-in routing system works. So we'll go inside the pages folder, and we'll go ahead and create a new file, and I'll just call this home.js. Okay, and in order to actually create a page, well, first let's go ahead and create a component the same way that we would do it in React. So const home page equals, and we'll just make this a simple function component, and we'll just return some JSX. So I'll just call this home page. Okay, now we need to make sure that this component, this function, is a default export. Okay, so we'll do export default home page. Okay, you could also do it the same way that they do it in the index.js file if you don't like arrow functions. Okay, but it doesn't really matter how you do it. So let's go over to our app, and let's go to the dashboard route. Oh, sorry, not dashboard, home. Okay, there we go. So now you can see that we are at the home page, and that is pretty cool. And again, like, I can literally do whatever I want with this page, like it's just a regular React component. Okay, so what I'll do is let me just do this real quick. Let me close the server, the next app, and I'm going to create a new folder called source. So if you like to have all of your stuff inside a source folder, you can just create a source folder, because by default it doesn't. And you can just move literally everything inside the source folder like this. I'll just move these styles and the pages folder inside source. We'll leave public where it is. And let's just run the app again. And it starts up immediately and nothing is going to happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new folder called components. And I'll create a new file. I'll just call this, I don't know, profile.js. And again, the same exact way we would create React components. So I'll create a profile component and I'll just return some hard-coded data. So what I'll do is I'll return, maybe let's do a span tag. And we'll just do username Anson. Okay, and then let's just go into the home page. Let's make this an H1. And let's just go ahead and import that profile component. And let's render that. And you can see that we have the profile component being rendered right over here. So that's pretty cool. If I wanted to create nested routes, or nested pages, I should say, all we would need to do is literally just create a subfolder. So let's say, for example, I have a dashboard. Okay, so I'll create the dashboard folder right over here. And then what I could do is if I want the dashboard route itself to render something, right? If I want that to be a recognized page, I could just do index.js. And then what I could do is I can just do export const dashboard page. And it will return some JSX dashboard page. Now let's go to dashboard. And you can see that, oh, whoops, we needed to make this a default export. Let's refresh. And you can see it says dashboard page. Now let's say I want nested routes for the dashboard page itself. So all we need to do is just create we can create a new file and you can name it whatever you want. So let's say I'll name this dashboard slash, let's call it analytics. Okay, just you can name it whatever you want, really. Let's do const dashboard analytics page. And let's just return a div dashboard analytics page. And don't forget to make this a default export, or export this function as a default export. And now, if I refresh, I'm still going to get the dashboard page itself. That's the root page, okay, the root page for dashboard. But if I go to /dashboard/analytics, you can see it'll take me to dashboard analytics page, which is pretty cool, right? And of course, if I wanted to create nested routes for /dashboard/analytics, right, I can create a subfolder inside dashboard and I can call it analytics. And what I'll do is I'll move this inside here. I'll rename analytics.js to index.js. Okay, so whatever the index.js is, that's going to just resolve into the root route. So for example, index.js is the file inside the analytics subfolder. So when you visit /analytics, like just /analytics after dashboard, it's going to render out whatever is inside index.js, right? So if I refresh, it will say dashboard analytics page. If I go to dashboard, right, it's going to render out the index.js. It's going to render out the function that is exported from index.js. Now, inside the analytics folder, I can go ahead and create a new file. And I'll just call this profits.js. Okay, maybe we want to see the analytics for profits, company profits, right? So let's go ahead and create a component called analytics profits page. Let me prefix this with dashboard, and let's just return a div, and I'll just copy this and paste this here, export this as a default export, and now I can go to /dashboard/analytics, and that'll be just fine. That'll render out the page for index.js. Okay, and then I can go to /profits, and then that'll go to dashboard analytics profits page. So that is how you can create complex nested routes with the built-in Next.js router. And it's actually pretty cool, so we don't need to worry about using stuff like, React router anymore. Okay, we can use the Next.js built-in router, which is cool. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And of course, I can also go inside the dashboard folder, and I can create a sub route for the dashboard route. So for example, maybe instead of analytics, we'll do something like, I don't know, jobs.js. Let's call it jobs. You can call it whatever you want. Like this is just all an example. Dashboard jobs page. Let's just return jobs, and then export just as a default export. And now I can go to /dashboard/jobs, and that will be its own page that is a sub route of dashboard. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now that you know how to create your own pages in Next.js, and you also know how to create nested routes for your pages in Next.js, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can create dynamic page routes for our application. So let's say, for example, for each, let's do this. Let's create another page. Let's call this, let's do this. Let's delete jobs.js. And let's go outside of dashboard. Let's go into pages. Let's create a new folder called jobs. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll create a new file. And I want to basically render dynamic jobs. Okay. So we'll have a regular page for the jobs route. So let's do const jobs page, return div jobs page. Okay, let's export default jobs page. So I can now go to /jobs, and that'll give me jobs page, right? Now, of course, in a regular application, let's say, for example, if we're building an app where it's going to list all of the jobs, and we also want to list out individual jobs based on their ID, right? So when we click on that job, it's going to navigate us to /jobs, and then the sub route is going to be the job ID, right? So we want to create a dynamic route for that. Okay, so what we could do is we can actually create a new file, and we can name it with square brackets. So square brackets, and then we can name this whatever we want. So let's say, for example, a common approach is to give it the ID name. So square brackets ID.js. Okay. And let's just call this not export, const, and I'll just call this jobs listing page. So this is just going to represent a single job listing by its ID. Okay, and for now I'll just return a div, and I'll just say jobs listing page. And now watch this. I can go to /jobs, and I can pass in whatever I want, and you'll see that it'll render out jobs listing page. So you can think of this as a route ID, similar to how you would handle route IDs in regular React applications using something like React Router, for example, right? Well, Next.js has this feature built in. So for example, this job ID could be, ID of 123, okay, or 1234. And typically what you would do is you would figure out what the ID is based on what is the route parameter. And you could probably, do something like take that route ID, fetch it from a database, and then get the result and then render it to the user. So now I'm going to show you how we can actually get this route ID, this dynamic route ID. It's actually very, very easy. So what I can do now is I can actually grab the route ID. So I'll show you how we can do it using the use router hook, which comes from Next router package. Okay, but then I'll show you how we can do it a more server-side rendered way using a function called getServerSideProps. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable called router, and then we'll go ahead and call the use router hook, and it comes from the next/router package. As you can see, it is imported up over here. Use router hook, and if I go ahead and reference router dot query, this will actually give you the route parameter. So watch this. If I refresh, if you look at the dev tools inside the console, you can see that we have the ID right over here, and I can reference router.query.id to get the ID of the job itself. So whatever I type in over here is going to be the value of query. Now this kind of this is doing it the client side rendered approach, right? Because let's say, for example, if you're using client side rendering, what you would do is you would get the route parameter. You would take that route parameter and then you would fetch the API or some API, passing in that ID, depending on what that resource is, and then you would fetch that resource. You would get it from the server, assuming that it exists, and then you would render it out into the DOM. Okay, but of course with Next.js, there's a different approach to how we can actually, handle this situation. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can do that. And this will jump into the next part of the video where we talk about data fetching. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next topic of server-side rendering in Next.js. So what we'll do is I'll show you how we can actually do data fetching in Next.js. Okay, so let's say, for example, when we use a regular React app with client-side rendering, we know how to fetch data. We typically use either fetch API or we use Axios or whatever HTTP data fetching library we want. And then what we do is we typically do it inside the useEffect hook. So a lot of you are familiar. We use the useEffect hook. We pass in a callback function. The callback function will then use the fetch API or Axios, whatever you want to do. Pass in the URL, fetch the data. And then what you'll do with that data is you'll update some state, and then you'll then render out that data to the DOM. That is all client-side rendering, okay? But when we want to use server-side rendering, we don't want to actually fetch the data inside a useEffect hook, because then that is going to depend on client-side rendering. We want to make sure we are server-side rendering our page, okay? So in order to actually fetch data, right, whenever we request the page itself, and also make sure we are server-side rendering our HTML, we want to actually use a function called getServerSideProps. Okay, now there's different functions, and it is dependent on the type of application you want to build. So getServerSideProps is specific to if you want to actually render the HTML on the server side upon each request. So remember, going back to the two different forms of pre-rendering, there is static generation as well as server-side rendering. Server-side rendering is where the HTML is generated upon each request. So we'll take a look at this example first, okay? Because it's actually a really straightforward example. And then we'll take a look at static generation, okay? But essentially, you want to use getServerSideProps when you want to actually render the HTML upon each request. So a good example is if you're building out an application that needs to fetch data from some data source that is going to be updated, a lot, let's say every second, every 30 seconds, every minute, every hour, right? You might want to consider using something like getServerSideProps. Okay, so let's go ahead and set it up. So in order to actually use the getServerSideProps function, we need to make sure we export it. It has to be a named export. So all we have to do is just do export async function getServerSideProps. Now getServerSideProps does take in an argument, and it's the context instance. And the context instance will give you a lot of different information about the request itself. So for example, if you want to get the cookies, you can get that from the context. Okay, now there's a couple things that you need to know about the getServerSideProps function. First things first is that you can only export this function inside a page, right? If you try to export this inside a non-page specific file, it's not going to work, and I think it'll actually error out. So it must be inside a page itself, okay? Another thing that I should also mention is that this function is only executed on the server side, and it never runs on the browser. So if you ever try to reference, anything that's specific to the browser environment, such as the window object, it's not going to work. If you try to use the fetch API, which is specific to the browser environment, it's not going to work. So I just want to mention that as well. Another thing that I should also mention is that getServerSideProps, this function is always going to be called upon each request, right? So it's called during request time. So every single time a client or a user requests this jobs page, the getServerSideProps function is going to be executed. Okay, so any data fetching that we need to do will be happening inside this getServerSideProps function. Okay, now whatever you choose to do with that data that is being fetched, you can do whatever you want with it. It doesn't matter. But one thing that you should know is that this function itself can actually return props that can be used to actually hydrate the page itself. So it's not return. It's not returns, it's return. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to just return props, so we'll return this props key. And then what I'll do is I'll just hard code this for now just to show you guys an example. So what I'll do is I'll just return a job, and I'll just give it the ID of 1, 2, 3, and then I'll just do title full stack engineering. Keep in mind that this is all hard coded just to show you an example of how this works. Okay, so this function is going to return an object. The object is going to have this props key, and it's going to map to an object. Okay, it has to be an object. And then inside this object, we can pass in whatever props we need. So you can pretend that this job data could be fetched from some API. Okay. Now we can then go into our component, our page component, and then what we can do is we can just pass in this props argument, and I'll just console log it for now. And if I go into our browser, you can see that if I refresh, you're going to see that it logs the props, and inside the props object, it has this job object over here. So whatever we return from getServerSideProps is going to be passed in as props for the jobs listing page. Pretty cool, right? So you can imagine, well, whatever we pass in here, it could literally come from anywhere. It can come from a database, because remember, right, getServerSideProps executes on the server side, so we can even call the database if we want to. So a common library that a lot of people tend to use is Prisma. So you can use something like Prisma Client to fetch data from the database and just literally, return it as props. And then those props can then be referenced on the page component itself. So hopefully that makes sense. So now I'll also go ahead and just console log the context object, so that way you all can see what it consists of. Now keep in mind that, like I said, the getServerSideProps function is executed on the server side, so you're not going to be able to see the logs in the console, and that's in the browser. You have to look at it in the actual terminal that you're using to run the actual Next app. So you can see that right over here, we have the context being logged, and you can see that the context has a bunch of properties. So let's just kind of like look through it real quick. So if I scroll up, you can see that we have a bunch of stuff. So right over here, I have the request object. So the request object is very, very similar to the request object in Express.js. For example, it has, it has headers, raw headers. It has the URL. It has the method. It has status code, client. It has cookies, if there are any cookies. There should be a headers section as well, I think. Maybe not. I think maybe right over here. There is the response object. Okay. There's, like I said, there's a lot of stuff. Okay, there's a lot of stuff. So other stuff that it has too. So for example, if you want to get the route parameter, you can then just reference context.params dot and then whatever the dynamic route is supposed to be. So for example, notice how our file name is square bracket id.js. So whatever you name that is going to reflect the name of the params over here. So for example, if I reference context.params.id, let's just refresh, that is going to be logged inside the console over here. Okay, now if I change this from ID to, let's just say, job ID, like that. Okay, and let's just log context.params. And I'll just pass in 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll see that the parameter is now going to be called job ID. Okay, so you can reference context.params.jobID. And if you refresh, it's going to give you the job ID. And you can use that to do whatever you want, right? You can use that to fetch the individual job by its ID from the database, for example. Okay, so that's how you can actually reference the actual route, the actual route parameter in the server-side context. Okay, so yeah, hopefully this makes sense. All right, so what I'll do now, just to show you how we can actually fetch data inside getServerSideProps, is I'm going to go ahead and fetch this JSON placeholder endpoint. So this is actually a great way to actually, test out your API calls. Let's say if you don't have a backend set up, but you need some mock data, you can actually use JSON placeholder. So what I'll do is I'll just fetch this endpoint full of users, and then I'll fetch it based off of the ID itself. So let's do this. So what we'll do is we'll go into pages. We'll go into, we'll create a new folder. Let's just call this users. So we'll just exit out of the jobs page. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's create an index.js file. So what we'll do is we'll first create the users page. And then we'll export this as a default export. And then we'll return a div and make this an h1. Now, users page is going to expect a props object as an argument, and that props object is going to contain the actual list of users to render. So, like I said, in order to actually fetch data where we can actually have server-side rendering, so that we can actually hydrate the actual page itself, so that way we don't perform client-side rendering, we want to export the getServerSideProps function. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to actually fetch data inside getServerSideProps, and then return that data inside the props object itself. So return props. Now we don't have the data yet, so we'll fetch it right now. Now the next thing that I'll do is I'll go ahead and use the fetch API. Now, one thing that I should mention is that Next.js does provide some polyfills, and fetch just happens to be one of them. So even though fetch is actually a browser API, we can actually still use it inside getServerSideProps. So const users, we'll do await fetch, and we'll pass in that URL to the JSON placeholder API link. So we'll paste that right over here. And what we'll do is this. We'll call then, and then we'll just do res.json. Okay, so this should return the actual array of users. Okay, and of course, if there are any errors that happen, we can just return an empty array. So let's fix this up a little bit. So let me do this. Let's do try catch. Okay, and then what we want to do is when the API call fails, we just want to return, I guess, an empty array of users. And of course, if it succeeds, then we can just simply return the response. So we'll do props users like this. So that'll be the array of users. And then if there's any errors, we'll just do return props users empty. Of course, you can also return the error as well if you want. Let me actually name this error. There we go. Okay. Cool. So that should be pretty much it. And now if I were to console log props, if we look at the browser now, so let's go to /users. You can see in the browser it has the users object, okay, and it has an array. Well, it's not an object; it's an array of user objects, right? And we have all of the users right over here. So I can just simply let's create a div real quick, and let's do props.users.map. And then we don't need to render every single piece of data. We just need to render maybe a few pieces of information. So for example, let's just render out the name for now. So let's pass in the key first. So user.id and then user.name. Okay, and there we go. So we have all the users being rendered. All right, so now let's go ahead and handle the case where we want to fetch individual users dynamically based on their ID. So the nice thing about this JSON placeholder API is you can actually pass in route parameters to get the user by its ID or whatever resource you're trying to access. So for example, if I just pass in users and then pass in 1 for the ID, it'll give me the individual user itself, which is great. So what we can do is we can create a dynamic page. So the parameter ID is going to, the parameter name is going to just be called, we'll just call it user ID. So the file will be called square bracket user ID.js. Okay. And now what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and call this page user page. Let me see, what did I call it here? Users page. I guess I'll just call this user profile page. Okay. And we'll return the div, of course. And now let's export this as a default profile page. And let's just make sure that Next.js does recognize this page. So let's go to user/1. And you can see it says user profile. Okay, so good. We're able to just pass in any user ID, and then it'll just render out this page itself. Okay, so that's good. So now what we want to do inside this user profile page is we want to actually fetch the data for that user. Okay, so again, we can use getServerSideProps because, like I said, this data could possibly change a lot. So we want to make sure that we are generating new HTML upon each request. Now, of course, if you know that this data is not going to change, you likely don't even need to use server-side rendering for this. You could just use static generation. But so that's why I'm saying you need to determine for yourself what you think is best for you. Right now, we have not done anything aside from just server-side rendering. We have not done any static site generation at all. We still have to talk about that afterwards, so don't worry. Okay, so let's go ahead and export the getServerSideProps function. Okay, and then what we'll do is we'll need the context argument. The context argument is going to allow us to get the parameter that we need to actually fetch the individual user itself. So in order to get the actual parameter, we'll just get that from the context.params object. So since the file name is square bracket user ID, so user ID is going to be the name of the route parameter. So we'll do const user ID equals context.params. So this will just destructure the user ID property from context.params. Okay. And then what we'll do is we will just go ahead and fetch the user from the URL. So let's go over here. So let's use a template string, and for the route ID, we'll just pass in $user ID like that. Okay, and let's just go ahead and use .den to convert the response to JSON. Okay, and of course this could throw an error, so let's just wrap this in a try catch. Let me rename this to error. Okay, if there's no errors, everything is successful, then we'll just return props, and then we'll just return user like this. You can even just move this all in one line. Okay, of course, if there is an error, then we'll just return an error like this. Okay, And so now for props, okay, we can then just render out the user itself. So let's delete this part. And so the user will have a name, username, email, etc. So I'll just go ahead and render out all of those details. So I'll create a div. I'll render props.user.name. Okay. Let's go ahead and render out the username, as well as maybe the email as well. Okay, and I'll also render out the ID. Okay. And that should be it. And of course, we'll also make it so that if there happens to be an error, or if there is no error, then we will render out all the stuff in a fragment. Okay, because there could be an error. Of course, if there is an error, then we probably will just display something like, oh yeah, failed to fetch user, or user not found, something like that. Because there could be, a user not found. As you can see, it'll return an empty object. Now, this API does not error out when you pass in an invalid ID, or like an ID where the user is not present. But of course, your API typically should return something like a 404, indicating that the user or the resource was not found. Okay. But for now, we'll just assume that these values are correct. Okay. So what we can do is let's go to /user/1. And so when we go to this page, let's see, error is not defined. Oh, wait, it's props.error. Sorry about that. Okay, so when I go to /user/1, it's going to give me Leanne Graham. If I go to /2, it'll give me the details for that user. If I go to /3, it'll give me the details for that user. Okay, so pretty cool, right? It'll basically fetch the profile or to fetch the user record for that individual user, and then it'll render it out in the DOM. And like I said, all of this stuff is being pre-rendered, right? It's being server-side rendered. Okay, so all of the HTML generation is happening on the server side, and then it's being sent to the browser, and the browser just loads the page. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're going to move on to static site generation, which is the other form of pre-rendering. So we have already discussed server-side rendering. We took a look at some examples. So now we're going to discuss static site generation, and I'll show you how we can actually use getStaticProps as well as getStaticPaths. Now, one thing that I did off camera was I set up my own Express server that was very identical to the fake JSON server that we were using to fetch user data. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I have just a simple Express server that returns jobs as well as users, and we'll just use this. And the reason why I'm doing this is because what we'll do is we will go ahead and fetch the data, and then you'll see how we can actually use static site generation. And you'll see that when we actually change the data on the Express server, the actual statically generated assets, the HTML that is generated statically, will not change at all. And it's important that you understand this. So that's why I am doing all of this, so you all better understand the difference between server-side rendering as well as static site generation. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go into our code. And so you can see that I've already changed the URL to the to my Express API that's running on localhost port 9001. But what I'll do inside the users endpoint is this. Well, actually, we won't change anything inside the users, not endpoint, the users page. We won't change anything aside from just replacing the previous URL, the JSON placeholder, with the with our local Express API. Okay. You don't have to do that if you don't have the Express API set up, okay? But what we'll do is we'll go inside the jobs page, the one that we set up earlier, okay? And what I'll do is I will go ahead and fetch the jobs from our Express API, and we'll do it using getStaticProps, okay? And so here's what we need to do. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing that we did with getServerSideProps. So getStaticProps is a function that needs to be exported in a page. And if you export it in a page, Next.js will call it. Now, one thing to note is that you cannot use getStaticProps with getServerSideProps. It doesn't really make sense, right? You can only have either getStaticProps or getServerSideProps. You cannot have both on the same page. It doesn't really make any sense. And if you try to do it, it'll throw an error. So for example, if I do export async get export async function getStaticProps, you can also take in the context argument if you need. And if I did getServerSideProps, right? It should error out if I go to the jobs page right over here. Yeah, it says you cannot use getStaticProps or getStaticPaths with getServerSideProps. Again, doesn't make any sense, right? Because you cannot use static site generation at the same time with server-side generation. Of course, though, if you want to have if you want to have two separate pages that where one page is using static site generation and the other page using getServerSideProps, or using server-side rendering, you can do that. But you cannot have one page that does both. Okay, so let's remove that and let's refresh. Okay, so now we just need to make sure we return something, of course. So we'll just return props. Okay, and again, it does the same exact thing as getServerSideProps. Only difference is when it's being executed, right? So remember what we said earlier with getServerSideProps, that function is going to be called upon each request during request time. So when you make a request to the page, getServerSideProps will be executed. getStaticProps will only be executed during build time. So when you're ready to build your application for production, it would call getStaticProps. Okay, of course, since we're in dev mode, it's going to call it. Okay, but here's what we'll do. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fetch our Express API. Okay, so we'll do const and we'll call this jobs awaits fetch. Okay, and then we'll do HTTP localhost port 9001/API/jobs. Okay, and like I said, I'll leave all the code in the description so you all will have a reference. So don't worry. Okay, so I'll leave the Express code as well as the Next.js code, so that way you guys can all set it up. Now some of you might be wondering, well, why am I not using the base API or like the default API layer that is integrated in Next.js? The reason why I'm not doing that is because the actual Next.js docs does not suggest you do that when you are fetching data from getServerSideProps because of performance issues. And I don't want to do that and introduce bad practice. So that's why I am using the Express API, and we're assuming that it's its own separate API. Okay. I figured I'd mention that for those who are curious. Okay. So let's just get the response in JSON format. And then what we'll do is we'll just return props, and we'll return this jobs array because we know that this is going to be an array. Okay. Now, of course, this could throw an error. I'm not going to worry about that for now, so we'll just return this jobs. Okay. So now let's remove all of this because we're no longer returning just one job, but returning an array of jobs. So what I'll do is this. I'll just actually do this. Let me just remove this and this, and I'll copy this, and I'll do props.jobs.map job, and then I'll create a div and then just paste this in here. And then we of course need to add a key. It's a job.id. And if I go ahead and refresh jobs, you can see that all of the jobs are being rendered. So we have 3 jobs from the API. 1, 2, or 4 actually. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Now, watch this. Okay. So right now we're using getStaticProps. Okay. Now, of course, if I were to change something in the API, right? Let's just pretend this, right? Let's just pretend that this is all coming from some database. Okay. Now, of course, if I change the ID, let's say, for example, if I add another, well, actually, let's not change the ID. Let's just add another job. And let's just call this Django Web Developer. Let's give this an ID of 60. Now, if I save this, and if I refresh, right, you're going to see that when I refresh, it's still going to get the latest data because we're in dev mode, okay? Now, watch this. Okay, here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go ahead and first exit out of the Next.js app. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the next build script. So this will actually create an optimized build for production. Okay, so let's do yarn build. Okay, so that shouldn't take too long. It's actually pretty fast. Once you have built the production, what happens next is you want to do yarn start. So I'll actually run the production version, not the dev version. Okay, so it's running on port 3000. So let's refresh the page. Let's go to port 3000. Okay, let's go to /jobs because we do have that route. So you can see right now it gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs. Okay, now watch this. I'm going to go ahead into my Express API, and I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these jobs except for one. And if I refresh, notice how I'm refreshing right now. Notice how none of the jobs from the page disappears, right? And the reason why is because all of this HTML has been statically generated. Okay, it was generated once during build time, and every request it is reusing that same HTML over and over and over again. Okay, so I really hope that this really helps you understand the difference between server-side rendering as well as static site generation, because it really is as clear as day, right? You can see that I removed all of the data from the jobs array from the Express server. This data can be from any source. It can be from a database. It can be from another external API, wherever it is, right? And when you change the data, either if it's in memory, in the database, wherever it is, right? Notice how it's not going to actually reflect on the actual jobs page itself, right? Because the jobs page is statically generated. Okay, now let me just go back to the Next.js project, and if we look at users, you can see with the users route. Okay, so I did change the URL from the JSON placeholder URL to the Express API. So right now the users page is being server-side rendered. Okay, so of course, watch this, right? If I go to the users page, you can see that we have all of our users. Now watch what happens if I go into the Express API and if I add more users. So let's just add one more user. Let's give it an ID of 4. Let's just say Derek Markson. Derek. So now notice how when I change the data on the Express server, okay, the actual data is being updated when I refresh the page on the users page for the next application in production, right? The reason why is because the users page is being server-side rendered, okay? And again, what that means is we have our getServerSideProps function that is being called, okay? And this getServerSideProps function is going to be executed upon each request. And what that means is every single time you make a request to this user's page, it is always going to call that function. It's going to perform any data fetching that you need, right? Which means that if that endpoint or if that resource is going to give you new information, then that means that the client will see the new information on the document itself, okay? It'll hydrate the page with the latest information from the source that you're fetching the data from, okay? Now, if I go into the individual user page, so let's say I go to /user/1, okay, right over here. You can see that I can also just change the data individually for the user. So right now we are seeing the user for Anson. So if I want to change it to Anson the dev, and if I save, okay, and I'm going back to the next app, and keep in mind that I am not restarting the Next.js app at all, right? We're in the production mode. We're in the production mode right now. So nothing is being changed. There's no hot reload, nothing. Okay, if I refresh this page, see how it says Anson the dev? It gives us the newest information because we are fetching the API every single time. And whatever the API returns back is what will be used to hydrate our Next.js page itself. Okay, so if you understand this, then you will definitely understand how you can actually use static site generation versus server-side rendering whenever you need to and however you want to. Okay, so it's very important that you understand this. If you don't, definitely practice a little bit more or leave your questions down below in the comment section, and I'll do my best to help you guys out. Okay, but hopefully this is enough to help you understand the difference. Okay, of course, like I said before, we were in developer mode originally, so no matter what happens, it's always going to call getStaticProps every single time because we're in dev mode. But once you're in production mode, it's only going to call it during build. It's only going to call it during a build time, and it'll reuse that HTML every single time. Okay, so when you actually build your application for production, it'll generate all of the HTML one time for getStaticProps. Okay, and then you'll need to rebuild the entire application if you want any additional changes for the HTML. And that is only if it's for a page that is using static site generation. Remember that not every single page is going to use only static site generation and only server-side rendering. You can create a hybrid app that uses both types of rendering methods. All right, so the next function that we'll look at is getStaticPaths. So we've looked at getServerSideProps, we looked at getStaticProps, and the last one is just getStaticPaths. Okay, and getStaticPaths is used when you need to generate a list of routes statically. Okay, so typically you'll use getStaticPaths with getStaticProps. Okay, so let's say for example, you might be fetching data from your database, right? Let's say your database has a jobs table, and you want to generate a single page for each job, right? And let's say your database consists of 10,000 jobs. Okay, so what that means is you want to statically generate a single page, or a single route, I should say, or I should say path, a single path for each record, for each job record in the database. Okay, and it's totally fine even if there's like 10,000, 20,000. It's fine because this function is only called during build time, similar to getStaticProps. Okay, remember, getStaticProps is called during build time, and getStaticPaths is also called during build time as well. So even if you have lots of data in your database, it's fine because it's only called once during build time when you're ready to build it for production. Okay, so in reality, what happens is it'll fetch all the data either from the database or some remote API, and then you'll use that data to generate all of the static paths for that page. So I'll show you an example. So what we'll do is we'll delete this getServerSideProps function that we had before, and let me also delete all of this stuff as well in our job listing page component. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and export a function called getStaticPaths like this. Okay, and what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and fetch all of the jobs from the jobs API that we have for our Express server. Okay, so let's do const jobs equals await fetch http localhost port 9001 /API /jobs. Okay, and then I'll just do .then res.json. Okay, and then what I'll do now is this. So jobs is going to return an array. So if I show you the API code right now, it's going to return this array right over here. Okay, and now like the number of jobs could be a lot. It could be 10,000, it could be 20,000, whatever. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and take this jobs array, and we're going to need to transform that array into an array of objects that has a params property, and that params property is going to need to map to an object where it has a key that matches the ID or the route parameter of our page itself. So I'll show you. So we're just return an object, and we're going to need to return this paths, and this is an array. So what I'll do is I'll do jobs.map. We're going to take each job, and we're going to return a new object. For each job, we will return a new object. So we're basically transforming everything. So the object is going to have the params key, which is going to map to an object itself. And this object needs to have a key. So notice how the key over here is going to be job ID. this key needs to match the file name itself. So you see how the file name is square bracket job ID. So let's say, for example, if this was named something else, like just ID, right? Then this right over here, this key over here needs to be ID itself. Okay. So, but since the file name is square bracket job ID, the key over here is just going to be job ID. Okay, and the value of this key is just going to be job.id, right? Because remember, job itself is this jobs array contains all the jobs fetched from our API. It could also be fetched from a database. Okay, we're going through each job, and we're going to just return a new object. Okay, params, and then job ID, which maps to just the job.id. Okay, and what this will do is this will literally just generate all of the paths for us. We also want to make sure we set fallback to false. So if there are any paths that just don't exist, it will just default to a 404. Okay, so now what we can do is this. Okay, what we can do is if I go to /job, so we're in dev mode right now, it's going to give us all of the jobs, okay, and this is the page that we're fetching the data from. If I go to /job/1, oh, let's see. Oh wait, it's complaining about it not being a string. That's because the ID from the API is a number. So let's just do parse int job.id. All right, let's refresh the page now. Oh wait, hold on. Sorry, not parse int. Silly me. Okay. All right, and now it's going to complain about getStaticPaths was added without a getStaticProps. So this is where we need to actually use getStaticProps as well. You cannot use getStaticPaths without getStaticProps. So all we need to do is just simply do export async function getStaticProps like this. Okay. And from here, we just need to return props, and then this is where we will return props for the page so that it can hydrate with the necessary data. Okay. Now, one thing that I should also mention is that we need to find out how exactly we'll get the data inside getStaticProps. I'll show you that next. But for now, let's just refresh. So you can see right now, you see how it says 404 because this page cannot be found. That's because there is no job ID in our backend for our Express server of 1, 2, 3, 4. Because remember, we're using the job ID to generate the actual dynamic route itself. So if I go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that is an actual job ID. You'll see that it will actually render out that page. If I go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, that will also render. If I go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, that will also render as well. But if I go to one that doesn't exist, it will just give us a 404. Okay, great. Now, the next question is, how do we actually get the actual props so that we can actually render the actual details for the job? Well, if you notice in the console, right, inside getStaticProps, we were logging the context, right? If you look at the context, we have this params object, and it gives you the job ID right over here, right? And that's just the route itself. Okay, so what we can do in conjunction with getStaticPaths is with getStaticProps, all we need to do is literally just fetch the actual individual resource, the individual job itself, but statically. Okay, so we'll do the same thing that we did with our let's see, where did we do it? Right over here. So what we did over here was we called this endpoint over here to get all the jobs. But this time we're just going to call the other endpoint that I also defined in the Express API. So if you look at the Express code over here, I have this other endpoint for users, which expects a route parameter, the ID, and it'll just search for the user. Or actually, no, I'm sorry, not user. We need to create one for job. So let me just do that real quick. It'll just be the same exact thing as the user endpoint. So I'll just do that real quick. And like I said, you don't need to do this. You can just watch this if you want to. It's totally fine. As long as you just understand what's going on. Because you're going to have your own implementation anyways, so you don't need to follow exactly the way that I'm doing it. But let's just go ahead and just find the job by its ID. So rec.params.id. And if the job exists, we'll send the job back. If it doesn't exist, you'll just send a 404. Same exact thing as user endpoint, okay? So if I go to our API, if I go to /jobs, that'll give us all of the jobs. If I go to /jobs/1, it's going to give us a not found. If I go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that'll give us the actual job over here. Perfect. So let's go into our job ID.js page. So inside getStaticProps, we'll just do the same thing. We'll just fetch the job. So await fetch. I'll use a template string, HTTP localhost port 9001/API/jobs, and we want to use a template string to actually get the job ID. So we'll do context. I think it's context.params.jobID, like this. We can double check that too if we need. Yep, params.jobID. Okay, and it's a string. That's totally fine. Now, since it's a string, I think it's fine. We don't need to. Yeah, it's fine. Okay, that's fine. All right, so of course, we'll return the job like this. Well, actually, wait. We need to call res.json. Okay. Cool. So now, let's see how this works. So let's go into our app. So let's go into here. Okay. Let me just remove this console log. Okay, so now let's go into the job listing page right over here. And I'm going to do job props.job.id. And then I'll just do a p tag title props.job.title. Okay. And you'll see that now it's going to render out the ID as well as the title. And if I go to any other job, okay, if I go to 1259, it'll give me Scrum Master. If we go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 60, if I change it to 61, it's going to give me a 404. Okay, so that's great. So all of the paths are generated statically. All the props are generated. We're not generated, they're being fetched. Okay, and it will be used to hydrate the actual page itself. And again, like I said, I can go even further to show you the major difference. So if I run yarn build, so let's actually run the build, because right now we're in dev mode. In dev mode, you're not really going to notice any difference because it's always going to call those functions no matter what. But if we actually run the build script and then run it in production mode, you'll notice a huge difference of what happens. Okay, so I'm going to run yarn start. We're in production mode right now. If I refresh, you'll see that it gives us a 404. That's fine. If I go to a correct job ID route, you'll see that it loads it extremely fast. Okay, Django Web Developer. Now, again, I can go to my Express API. I can change the title. So Django Backend Developer. Okay, I'll change it. And the Express app should restart. Right, I can even manually restart it. I have NodeMon running, by the way. But if I refresh, notice how that does not change at all because all of this is statically generated. Okay, it generates the HTML one time, and it's being reused upon every request. And no matter what happens with this jobs page, it's never going to affect the other pages that do in fact use server-side rendering. So notice how we can go to the users page right over here. I can change something in the users. I can add another user right over here. Let's do that. Let's do Terrence Richardson. Random names. Okay. And if I refresh, you'll see that because we're using server-side rendering, it's going to fetch the latest data from the endpoint, and it's going to then show it on this actual page itself. Okay. So pretty cool, right? Pretty cool. And of course, one more thing that I should also mention is that if we go back to jobs, right? Notice how, like I said, none of the data changes. Django Web Developer, even though we changed it to Django Backend Developer, that doesn't change at all. Okay, and notice how if I go to the job ID 123460, right? that'll give us Django Web Developer. And notice how even if I add another job here, let's make the ID 123461, and let's change this to Golang Developer, and the Express server will restart. You'll notice how that even if I try to access that route, it's going to say 404. Compared to using getServerSideProps, right? If you're using server-side rendering, you would actually get new routes every single time based on the data changes, okay? But because this is statically generated, when you make a change in the backend or whatever data source is being changed, none of that is going to ever affect the Next.js app itself because we're using static site generation, okay? And now in order for the changes to even reflect, when you're using static site generation, you just have to, whoops, that's the Express app. So here's what we'll do. Let's rerun the server. And let's go ahead, let's go into the Next app terminal and let's run the build script again. Okay. And I want you to think of it like this. When the build script is happening, what really happens is it's calling all of the functions that need to be called. So for example, getStaticProps, getStaticPaths. Those are being called. Okay. And you can see over here that it even says, right over here in the logs, it generated 6 paths, right? It generated these 3 and then plus 3 more paths. And let's see if that's accurate. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Perfect, right? And I can even add more paths. So let's add 3 more. So 2, 3, 4. And let's just call this Scala backend engineer. Let's call this C++ developer. Let's save this. Okay, and let's run the build script again. And you'll see that once it's done, it's going to generate all of those paths statically. So notice how it says generated plus 6 more paths. So it generated 9 total, which makes sense, right? And that's why I said earlier, this could have 10,000 records. It doesn't matter. Okay, it'll generate a single path for each individual record. Okay, assuming that there are no duplicates, which of course your backend should account for that. Okay, but hopefully that makes a lot of sense, and hopefully that gives you a good perspective of how all of this stuff works. So now if I do yarn start, okay, now if I refresh this page, it's no longer going to give us a 404 because we actually have that path being statically generated. If I go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 5. Okay, perfect. It is working as intended. So hopefully all of this stuff makes sense. All right, so now that we have gone over, I would say probably the most difficult concepts that most people tend to have issues with in Next.js, which is just understanding server-side and static site generation, or server-side rendering and static site generation. We're going to move on from the data fetching topic, and we're going to go ahead and focus more on just like stuff that you can do on the actual client side itself. So let's just go back into our Next.js tutorial project. Let's just run the dev script, so yarn dev, and let's go back into our project. So I will show you how we can add CSS for our components. So let's say, for example, for each job. So what I'll do is this. I'll create a job component right over here. Okay. And this is just going to render out the job, but we want to add some styling to it. So I'll do export const job item. And then this will just return a div. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to just render the title of the job as well as the ID. So I'll just do, let's do a simple, maybe like an H1. Okay. And this is going to take in a prop of job. So we'll do props.job.title. And of course, if we had a description of the job, we would pass it in, but we don't have any right now, so we won't worry about that for now. So just for now, just render the ID. Okay, and I'll show you how we can style this in just a second. Let me just go into right over here. And what we'll do is for each job that we are rendering, we'll do job item. We're going to pass in a key, job.id like that. And we'll pass in the job itself like this. Okay, and then let's go into the jobs page. And you can see that right now we have all of our jobs being displayed. Cool. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add some styling to this. So in Next.js, there's many different ways that you can add CSS. There is built-in CSS support. So the first thing that you could do is you can use global style sheet. So for example, you can see right over here, I have this globals.css file, which is imported inside the underscore app.js file. As I've mentioned before, this is kind of like the main entry point of the application, right? This is where all of the components start, like the root component, right? So you can see over here, we are importing the global CSS file. So you can actually create other CSS files if you don't want to put everything in one file and just import that in here. So for example, I can just do something like jobs.css, and then I can just do something like, you know, jobs, job item. I like to personally use camel case. You don't have to if you don't like it, but I'll just do job hyphen item. And what I'll do is I'll just give this a background color of, let's just do 1A, 1A, 1A. And then we'll just do font size. Let's just do background color for now. Okay, let's go ahead and import that style. So style / jobs.css. And then what I could do is I can go inside the job item component. I'm going to rename this to job item instead of just job. And then I can just attach the class name, same way that you would do in React, and just pass in the job item class like that. And if I refresh, or I don't even need to refresh, it'll auto reload for us. You can see that the job item itself has the actual CSS style. Now, another thing that you could do is you can actually use Sass with Next.js. So if you don't like using just regular CSS and you prefer using Sass, you can just rename this to an SCSS file. But of course, it will throw an error. Let's refresh this. Hold on. Wait, let's go back into the underscore app.js file. Let's change the import to jobs.scss because that did not auto update. But you'll see that it's going to complain about the Sass. Sass is not installed. So we can just very easily install that by doing yarn add Sass or npm install Sass. Rerun the app. Refresh the page. Okay, there we go. And now I can use Sass. So I can do stuff like ampersand h1. So this will target the h1. And I can change the font weight if I want to. I can change to maybe like, I don't know, maybe like 500, I guess. Or 400, whatever you like. Right? You can change the font size. Maybe you don't like the default font size of the h1 tags. Change to 24 pixels. Do whatever you want with it, basically. Okay. I can target the p tag if I want to. Change the color to maybe a grayish color. Let me just change it something like this, maybe. There we go. You can do whatever you want with it. It's up to you, right? But I figured I would just mention to you all that you can use Sass if you want. Okay. Cool. So that's how we can style our components. You can also use something called CSS modules or SCSS modules. So for example, let's go into components. I'll create a new file and I'll call this job.module.scss. You can call it CSS if you want, or the extension you can call it CSS. It just depends if you want to use Sass or not. I personally like using Sass. Okay. And then what I can do is I can create a class like this job title. And whenever I'm using CSS modules, I'll tend to use camel case. Okay, instead of using kebab case like this. So for the job title class, I'll set the font size to 64 pixels. And then what I need to do is inside the component or any component that I want to actually style the component itself, I'll import the SCSS module. So I'll do import styles from job.module.scss. And then what I'll do is this. So for the h1, I'll go ahead and pass in the class name. and I'll reference styles, and I'm going to reference the job title class from the SCSS module as if it's an object property. So like this, job title, like that. And I think it should, I don't think it'll override global CSS, so you do have to be a little bit careful. So what I'll do is I'll go into the jobs.scss right over here, and I'll just remove the h1 styling because it doesn't seem like it'll override it. And you can see now, if I change the font size to 100 pixels, it will change it to 100 pixels, like that. So that's how you can style your components with SCSS and CSS modules. Okay, so, like I said, in terms of CSS and styling, nothing really is different in Next.js. All right, so now another thing that I love to also introduce to you all that Next.js supports is layouts. So let's say, for example, you want to build complicated structures for your UI, but you want to do it in a reusable fashion. You can create a simple layout that you can reuse across any page you want. And it's actually pretty easy, and I'll show you all how to do that. So what I'll do is I will go inside the components folder. I'll create a new folder called layouts. And a layout is really just a React component. Okay, so I'll create an index.js file. And we're just going to create a simple React component. So we'll just do export default function layout like this. Okay. And inside this layout, you can place, any, HTML element, any other additional components that you want to apply to every single page that will use this layout. So for example, some pages you want a sidebar, some pages you want a top level navigation bar, some pages you may want, a sidebar, a page in the middle, and then a right hand navigation bar or whatever, type of bar you want, right? There's different types of layouts that you can set up however you'd like. So that's why there's no right or wrong answer to this, but I'll show you how to set up a simple one. So what we'll do is we'll return a fragment, and inside this fragment, we're going to return a nav bar. So we'll do nav like this. And I'll just simply use an unordered list just to keep everything simple. And I'll just say home, and we'll duplicate this 3 more times, and we'll just say about contact support, something like that. Okay. And now what we want to do is after we have our nav bar, we need to have a section that will actually render out the page itself, right? Because remember, the layout is going to be for the page, right? So what we'll do is we'll use a main tag. You can use a div if you want, but main is a good HTML element that you can use to represent the main content of your of the document, right? And inside in between the main tags, we want to actually render the children. So the layout itself, right, is going to take in props. And one of the props is going to be the child prop, the children prop. And the children prop is really just going to be the next page, the Next.js page itself. Okay, so we'll render this out like this. Okay, the same exact way of how you would render out realistically any child node in React. Okay, and if you want to add other stuff to, like a footer, if you want to also add CSS, you could do that any way you want. Okay, but what we'll do now is we need to actually apply this layout to the actual page. Okay, so you can do this, right? You can either apply the layout to every single page, or you can apply it to a specific page. I'll show you how we can apply it to every single page. So what I'll do is I'll go into the underscore app.js file. Remember, this is pretty much like the root component, if you want to think of it like that. And what you're going to do is you're going to import this layout over here. So let's do import layout from, we'll go into the components folder, layouts, and that should import the layout itself. We'll take this component, okay, right over here, this whole component, and then what we'll do is we'll just render out layout, and then what we can do is just simply do this. Okay, and now if I refresh the page, or again, I don't even need to refresh, but you'll see that in the jobs page, you can see that I have my nav bar up top over here. Okay, and then I have the page itself. Okay, and again, if I want to style the nav bar, I could, right? I can even just put this inside a global, I can just put this inside the globals.css file. So I could just do something like, layout nav bar. And, well, let me actually do this. Let me actually create a new file, and I'll call this layout.scss. And I am going to go ahead and import that right over here. So import styles layout.scss. And then I'll go ahead and just do nav bar. And I personally like using Sass because it's just really freaking awesome. So what I'll do is I'll select the unordered list. I'll set the list style type to none. And then what I'll do is inside the layout component for the nav, I'll give the class name of navbar like this. And we no longer have the bullet points for our list. We can set the margin to 0 and padding to 0. And I can also set the unordered list to a display of flex. And I can, and then what I want to do is I want to set the gap of the items to 10 pixels, I guess, so I can space it out. Again, like I said, you can style it however you want. I'm just kind of just showing you all examples, right? But what I'll do is I'll give a background color for the nav bar, and I'll just make it a simple, I'll make it a darkish color, like maybe like this color right over here. And you can see that this is what it looks like. You can give it some padding if you want to, right? It's up to you how you want to style it. Okay. You can even add media queries to make it responsive if you want. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Okay. And of course, if I want to add a footer for our layout, I could, right? I can just say something like, 2022 down over here, and you'll see all the way down below on the footer, it has 2022. Like normally people display like, like the company copyright, like stuff like that. I just do something like, Next.js course by Anson 2022. And that will be all the way down below on the footer. And the layout will be applied to every single page. So if I go to users page, you'll see the layout will be applied over here as well. If I go to if I go to the individual users route, it'll be applied to that page as well. Okay, so that's one way they can set the layout for every single page. If you want to have different layouts for different pages, you can also do that as well. I'll show you how to do that. So this is actually going to require a little bit more additional modification, but it's okay. It's pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do is inside our my app function, so the root, I'm just going to call this the root component from now on. What you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and reference a getLayout function that is going to be called, and it's going to take in the actual component itself, like this component right over here, the page itself, right? This component over here is really just a page that is going to be rendered. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to dynamically attach a function called getLayout on each page that needs a custom layout. So let's say, for example, we want the layout to only be applied to the users page. So this one over here. What we'll do, and this is actually very easy to do in JavaScript. If you're doing this in TypeScript, you need to do a bunch of type annotations. But we'll do users page dot get layout. Okay. And then what we'll do is we're going to assign this get layout property, and this is being assigned dynamically, right? We'll assign it to this function called getLayout. Okay. And this getLayout function is going to take in a parameter, which is the page that is going to be rendered. Okay. And then we're just going to return. Now we're going to need to import that layout that we created right over here. So I'll import that from the components layouts folder. So import layout from, let's go into the components folder, go into layouts. Okay, and since it's the default export inside the index.js file, we don't need to specify the actual index file itself. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll render the layout, Okay, and then we will just simply render the page as is, like this. Okay, and this page over here is just going to be this user's page. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to go into the root component, and we simply just need to go ahead and reference the page instance, right? Because remember, this component over here is actually the next page type, right? And it's going to have this get layout property if you attached it to the page itself. All right, so the next thing that we need to do is inside the root component, inside my app, we're going to go ahead and declare a variable. We're going to call it get layout, and the value of get layout is going to be a function, okay? And that function is going to be either the layout function that we assigned to our page. So you can see right over here in the users page, we have users page dot get layout equals function get layout. This is literally just a React component. Remember, React components are just functions, right? That return JSX right over here. And so we're going to reference component because component is the actual page instance. And so that page instance could have this get layout property defined. So we'll do component.getLayout. And this is implying that get layout is an actual function or an actual function component, right? Of course, if you're using TypeScript, you could type annotate all of this. And the Next.js docs has lots of examples that show you how to do that with TypeScript. Now, component.getLayout, this could be undefined, right? Because not every single page might have a layout, okay? So what we can do is we can say, okay, well, if component.getLayout is undefined, we can use the OR operator. So if it's undefined, then it will just resolve the value on the right-hand side. And the value on the right-hand side is literally just going to be a function that literally just returns the page itself. Okay, so think of it like this, right? When we have component.getLayout, the value of this getLayout variable is just going to be a function, and that function takes in the child node, which is just the page itself, right? And that page is going to be rendered as a child in between the layout component. Okay, as you can see right over here, that's happening right over here. It's really very similar to how you render child nodes in React, right? And so we're going to need to call the getLayout function because this is really just a function. So when we call the getLayout function, we're going to need to pass in the component, which is just the page itself. So we can render that like this. So whoops, let me fix that. So component, just like that. Of course, we want to make sure we pass in any props or the page props if there happen to be any. So we'll destructure that and pass all of them down to the page itself. Now, of course, if the getLayout property is not defined on the page, it will just go ahead and return this right-hand side value. So that's just a regular function, and all this does is it just literally doesn't do anything at all. It just takes in the page and it just returns a page, which again doesn't do anything. Okay, so all that's really happening is just rendering the component like this. Whoops, like, let me show you, like this. So that's what it would look like if component.getLayout was undefined. Okay, so this will handle that case for us. So now let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go into our application. So you can see that right now in the jobs page, I don't have the layout applied, but if I go to users, I do. Okay, now if I go to, let's go to users 1, 2, 3, 4, 60. I don't even know if this is a valid route. Probably not. So let's go to jobs 1. Okay, that's 404. Let's go to the home page. So you can see that the layout is not applied to every single page. So if I go to /user/1, you can see that even on the sub page or the sub route of the users page, you can see that the layout is not even applied to that page. But if we wanted to apply that layout, we could. All we have to do is literally just go here, go into the user ID.js file. That's where the that's where the dynamic page based on the route is, and all we have to do is just reference user profile page.getLayout, and literally you can apply. You don't have to apply the same layout as well. You can apply a different layout if you want to. Okay, but what I'll do is I'll just apply the same one. So we'll just do page and then return and then layout and then page like that in between the curly braces. And if I refresh the page now, the layout is now applied. Okay, you can see we have our nav bar. So that's how you can apply layouts. And of course, you can make more complex layouts. Maybe some layouts might need sub layouts. You can also do that as well. So feel free to be creative with Next.js layouts. Alright, so now I'm going to show you how we can actually navigate users on our application. So there's definitely different ways that you can do this. We're going to look at both ways. So we're going to look at the next link component. So this is a component that you can use to set up links for text. So that way when users click on it, it'll navigate them to a different part of the application. So it's actually very easy to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to import link from next link right over here like that, and we're inside the users page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add dynamic links for each one of these users, right? Because right now I have 6 users and each user has its own ID, and if I visit the actual dynamic route by passing in the user's ID, so let's say if I pass in users/1 for the ID, this will pull the data for user ID of 1. If I go to users/2, this will give me the data for user number 2, right? But I want to make it so that when we actually click on the user's name right over here, it'll actually navigate us to their correct profile page. Okay, we can do that using the link component. So I'll show you how we can do that. So what we'll do is let's copy this part inside the div, because right over here on line 10, we are dynamically rendering all of the users. Okay, and so what I can do is I can go ahead and use the link component, and then I can pass in an href. Okay, and for the href, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a template string, which I think we actually not like that. It'll have to be like this. So curly braces and then backticks. And then right over here, we'll go ahead and pass in the /users/ and then the ID of the user like that. Okay, and then let's go ahead and close this. And then we'll wrap our text in between an A tag. Okay, so what happens here is for each user element, we're going to first render, or not user element, I should say, for each user object inside the user array, right? We're going to render a div, and then we're going to render inside the div, we will render the link component. And then for each link, it's going to have the attribute href. And this is going to be dynamic based off of the user's ID, right? So for the first user, it will have a link of /users/ and then user ID will be 1 because that's the first user. And then we'll have the user's name right over here. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh, and you can't really tell, but you can see that there's a cursor right over here, and if you look very closely on the bottom left, there's actually different links that you can see on the bottom left of the browser. So for this one, this is user number 1. If I click on it, you see how it navigates me to user number 1's profile page. I can go back and I can click on Jack Daniels, so that's users/2, and it'll navigate me to that page. Okay, I could do the same thing for all of the other pages, and that works out pretty great for us. All right, so this is how we do it with server-side rendering. Okay, now doing it with static site generation, or pages that use static generation, it's relatively almost the same exact thing. So for example, inside our jobs page, which uses static site generation, inside getStaticProps, we are fetching all the jobs, and then we're returning all of those jobs there. So we could do the same exact thing that we did in our users page inside jobs page. Okay, it's really not that much different. So let's take a look at this job item. So let's go here. So let's go inside job item, and let's go ahead and apply a link to the job item. But we're not going to actually apply a link though. What we'll do instead this time is I'll show you how we can actually use the router to route the users. So before we used the link component, but I'll show you how we can do it using the router. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable called router, and we're going to call the use router hook. So that's built in with Next.js. and you can see that it is imported from next/router. Okay, import use router from next/router right over here. Okay, and then with the router, what we can do is we can reference this push method, and the push method takes in a URL. Okay, and that's what we'll do. So what we'll do is for each job title, so for each one of these h1 elements, I'll just register a click event, and then I'll go ahead and pass in a callback function, and whenever we click on the h1 element, we will call router.push, and then we're going to have to pass in the path to the actual job. So we'll do backticks, and then we'll do /jobs/ $sign. So this is a template string, and we need to pass the job ID. So props.job ID. And the reason why we're passing the job ID, well, that's the dynamic ID that we're using for the dynamic route. Okay, so that's the reason why we are passing the job ID. Okay, so if I were to go to /jobs right now, you can see that, let's zoom out. Whoops, zoom out a little bit. Okay, so you can see that right now, if I hover over these titles, which is where we have the event listener being registered, right? You can see that it doesn't really show you that it's an actual link. You can see that the cursor is not the hover cursor. But if I click on these though, it will programmatically navigate me to the correct page, right? As you can see, that is happening right now. Now, of course, I'm only showing you this as an example. Personally, I believe that it would be better if you used the link component, because it actually acts like it itself is a link. And for all of these h1 tags, they're not really links. We're just using the router.push method. But I just figured I would show you how you can use the router.push method to actually programmatically navigate, because sometimes you might need to do that. So I figured I would show you an example on how to do that. So that is pretty much how you can create navigation for your application using either the router or just the link component. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can create a custom document in our Next.js application. And with this custom document, you can use it to update the HTML and body tags of your document. So if you've used Create React App before, you'll notice that there is this index.html file inside the public folder. So right over here, I have a project that was created using Create React App. And in the index.html file, you can think of this like the root document, or not the root, the main document that has all of the JavaScript then generated to render out the HTML so that our users can actually use the application. Now you'll notice that in between the head tags, we have this link that references the Google font, and we can then use the Google font in our application. Now you may be wondering, well, how can I do something like this in Next.js? So I'll show you. And in order to do that, we need to use a custom document. Okay, so what we'll do inside our application, let me just refresh this. So inside our application, let's go into our code. We're going to go inside the pages folder, and we're going to create a new file, and it's going to be called _document.js. The underscore is important. You need that underscore. Okay, so _document.js. And then we're going to create a function, and we'll call it document. And this function is going to be our component, obviously. It needs to be a default export, like that. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to need to return some JSX. But that JSX, we're going to use the built-in components that is provided from Next.js. So the first component that we're going to use is the HTML component. And this is literally equivalent to the HTML tag. So after we have the HTML tag, we're going to need to render out the head tag, and I'll show you how we can do that. So there is this head tag, or this head component that comes from the next/document package, and then we're going to render it like this. One thing to note is that the head tag itself, the head component, there's actually two different head components. There's one that comes from the next/document, and there's one that just comes from next/head. These are two different ones. The one from the next/document package, you use this to apply certain attributes and properties for your document for all of your pages. Okay, so for example, let's say if we really wanted a title to be applied to every single page, we could do that inside the head tag. But if you do that, it will actually complain. ESLint will complain because it's not recommended to apply a global title for every single page. And I think it's because it's bad for SEO. So I think they let you know about that. But if I really wanted to, I could, right? So if I apply this title over here, this title will be applied to every single page. Okay, but of course, like I said, we're not going to do this. I just want to show you as an example. Now, the last thing that we need to do is we need to, of course, render out the body tag. So there is no custom body component that comes from Next.js package. It's just going to be a regular body tag, the same one that you would use in HTML. And then in the body tag, we need to render out the main component like this, and that comes from next/document. And then we need to render out next script like this. Okay, and we're pretty much done. So let's go into our application. And if I refresh, you'll see that the title of the page is Anson the developer. If I go to any single page, the title will be the same thing. But of course, we don't want to do this for all the pages. And I'll show you how we can set the title for individual pages after. Okay, but now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and import a Google font. And then what I want to do is I want to apply that font for our entire application. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just go over here and I'll just copy this link right over here. And you can very easily just go to fonts.google.com and just grab your favorite Google font. You can use whatever you want, doesn't really matter. So you can go to this website. I already have the link already copied already, but you can just copy from here. I'll probably just use the same one, so I'll just copy this instead of copying the one from the other code. And I'll copy that, and then I'll go into the head tags, and I'll paste that right over here. Okay. And let's just kind of fix this up a little bit, because we do need to make sure we close the link tags. Otherwise, it will complain about it. Because remember, we're still working with JSX, not regular HTML. So we do need to close these tags. Okay. And so now that we imported them in the head tags, we can then go into our globals.css and let's apply the font globally to our application. So let's just pass an enter like that. And I don't know if it's noticeable. There we go. Now you should see that the font has been applied. Okay, if I were to just remove this whole thing, the font goes to the regular font. If I just do font family enter, you can see that it is definitely noticeable. Okay, the font is definitely different. So that works, and that is great. Okay, so that's how we can import Google Fonts, doing it this way if you need to do it this way. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll show you how we can go into individual pages, and we can set the certain title for each specific page, and I'll show you other stuff that we can do as well. So let's go ahead and remove this title. And what we'll do is we'll go into our individual page. So let's go into the jobs page first. Okay. And so the first thing that we'll do is we'll import the head component. And this component is going to come from next/head and not next/document. So notice how this component right over here came from next/document. We also have a head component that comes from next/head. The major difference between these two is that the one that comes from next/document, which we're using right over here, should only include tags that should be applied to every single page. So for example, if you have stuff that are common, such as, a Google font import or CSS, you want to put that in the document component in between the head tags. If you have something that is specific to an individual page title, you want to use the head component that comes from next/head. Okay, so for example, you're not going to have the same title for every single one of your page. So that's why it also tells you that in the ESLint. So it encourages good practice as well. So now what we're going to do is if we wanted to set a custom title for this document, for this jobs page, right? Because each page itself is its own HTML document, okay, that is pre-rendered on the server. So inside this div, we'll go ahead and use this head component like this. And then we're going to go ahead and set a title for this jobs page. And notice how ESLint does not complain. Okay. And for the title, we'll just go ahead and set this as available jobs, like that. If I go to the application, if I go to /jobs now, you'll notice how the title says available jobs. Okay. Cool. And what we could do is we can also set other tags as well. We can also set meta tags if we want. If you're familiar with Open Graph, which is pretty cool. So for example, if you're familiar with Discord, whenever you send a link in the chat, or even on Slack too, it will usually show like a preview of that link. Like it'll show like an image, it'll show the title of the page, it'll show a description of the page. If you're familiar with that, that all can be done using Open Graph protocol. Okay, and it really also helps a lot with SEO as well. Okay, but I'm not going to do that in this tutorial. You can very easily just go to the documentation on Next. I'll show you over here. You can very easily go over here, and they show you examples on how to set the meta tags right over here. So you can see over here, OG Open Graph title. So that'll set the title of the embed message if it was on Discord, for example. Okay, so this also helps out a lot with SEO as well. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty cool. And of course, I can go into the jobs listing page, and I can also set the set a custom title. So let's import head from next head, and then right over here we'll do head, and then for the title, we can set the custom title. So props.jobs.title. Right over here for the title. So the name of the job as the title. So if I click on here, let's see, can I read properties of undefined? Oh, it's job, not jobs. There we go. You can see that the title is going to change based on the job that I click on. Okay, and like I said, this is very great for SEO. Okay, so that is pretty much it with the custom document component, as well as using the head tag. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the built-in API layer that is part of the Next.js server. So if I were to go to my application, and if I were to go to /API/ and then the name of our route. So in this case, I have this hello route. Now this is a route that was automatically generated when we created our Next.js project. So if you deleted it, that's okay. You can just very easily recreate it. But you can see that when I go to this URL over here, it gives me back JSON, like a regular web server would do. Okay, so we can use this API layer to perform server-sided tasks if we need it, of course, right? Sometimes you might not even need to use this, but in some cases you might need some kind of backend that needs to take care of fetching external data. Maybe, for example, you need to fetch data from some other external API, but you also need to pass in an API key or like a token. And of course, you don't want to send that token from the client side because people on the client side can easily see it, right? So you definitely want to have all that stuff happen on the server side. It's more secure that way. Okay. Of course, if you don't want to set up an entire backend using Express or using Next.js or even something like Django or Spring Boot, and if your needs are very simple, you can just very easily get by with the Next.js API server. So I'll show you how we can build custom API endpoints using the Next API layer. So let's go into our code, and you can see that I have this hello.js file. So the routing with the API layer is actually very, very similar to how you set up routes with your pages. Now, this API subfolder inside the pages folder was already auto-generated when we created our Next.js application. Of course, if you delete it, nothing bad is going to happen. But if you do want to use the API layer, you must have all of your routes, all of your files inside this API subfolder inside pages, okay? So let's go ahead and delete hello.js. So I'll go ahead and do that, delete, okay? And what I'll do is I'll create a new file, and I'll go ahead and create a file called users.js. So like I said, the routing is very identical to how we set up routes with our pages, right? So whatever name you name the file, inside the API folder, that is going to be the name of the endpoint. So right over here, I have the file named users. So the endpoint will have an endpoint called /API/users. Okay. Now every single endpoint file, so every single file that you have inside this API folder, you'll need to create a default export, and the function is going to be called handler. Now, every single one of these API files, you're going to need to export a default function called handler. And the handler function takes in two parameters. It takes in the request object, which is very similar to the express request object if you've used Express before, or Fastify. And then the second parameter is the response object. Okay. Now, one thing that I should note is that with the Next.js API layer, you need to actually handle the request methods yourself. So notice how in Express, you can do stuff like app.get, app.post to set up, different types of HTTP requests. In Next.js, you have to do that yourself by checking the request.method property. And so, for example, if I want to make sure that users or customers can only make GET requests to this /users endpoint, then what I can do is I can say if rec.method is not equal to, and this has to be in capitalization, get, all capitalized, get, right? If it's not equal to get, we can just return a status code, so res.status. So it's very similar to how you would do it in Express. So res.status, I'll send a status code of 405, and then I'll call .send message method not allowed, like that. So of course, if it is a GET request, then I'll just send back some data, right? So we'll do return res.send, and I'll just send an empty array for now. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Now let's go into Thunder client, and what I'll do is I'll create a new request, and I'll go ahead and make a GET request to localhost port 3000 /API/users. And you can see it gives us a 200. It gives us that empty array. If I were to make a post request, it would say method not allowed. And of course, if you want to handle different types of request methods, right, you can use a switch case, for example. So we could do something like switch rec.method, and then for each case, handle the case for GET request, return res.send, send out an empty array. If it's a post request, you can, create a user or create a resource, whatever it is that you want to do. Okay. We'll just do res.status, and then we'll just do 201 send. Okay. If you want to handle delete requests, handle the case like that. Okay, it's very, very straightforward. If you wanted to reference the request body of a post request, so for example, let's go ahead over here. Let's create a users array right over here, and we'll just send the users array like that. So whenever we send a post request, we'll add the data to the users array. We're not going to do anything like validation for now, because we're not going to make this super complicated. But if we wanted to get the data from the request body, we can reference rec.body. So it'll give us everything from the request body that we sent to the server. And I'll just simply do users.push rec.body like that. And then we'll just send an empty object, okay? And so let's go into Postman. Let's go ahead and make a GET request. It'll give us back an empty array. But now let's make a post request. And let's go ahead and just pass in some JSON. So just do username Anson. Okay, and let's make the GET request again. So now it gives me that array. If I look at the console, let's see where we were over here. Okay, so inside the console, you can see that it says username Anson. So that's the request body that we sent to the server. Okay, of course, if you wanted to also reference things like route parameters, query parameters, you would get that from the request.query object. Okay, you can even console log the request object yourself and see all the different types of properties that are on the request object. Okay. Now, one thing that I should also mention is that there is no rec.params property on the request object. Okay. And that leads us to the next thing that I want to also talk about. If you wanted dynamic routes for your endpoint, so let's say, for example, right, I have this user's endpoint, but let's say, of course, a common REST API would typically have a route parameter that can give you an individual resource based on the ID or some identifier, right? So, for example, if you wanted to get a user by its ID, we would have like a route ID or a route parameter where you would pass in the user's ID. Okay, so I'll show you how we can set that up as well. So let's create a new folder. So again, it's very similar to how you would do this with setting up routes for your pages that the users will visit. Okay, so we can create a subfolder inside the API folder, call it whatever we want. I'll call it users. I'll go ahead and rename this file, this users.js file, to index.js because I'm going to move this inside the users folder. Okay. And this setup is identical to what we had previously with the users.js file inside the API folder. Okay, so since we have the index.js file, this function handler will handle the route /API/users. Okay, but the reason why we would create the subfolder is, let's say if we wanted nested routes that come after users. So maybe we want something like /users/ID/ posts to get all the users' posts. We would put those file names inside the users folder. Right. So for example, if I created a posts.js file, and then let me just copy and paste the handler function, and I'll just send back I'll just send back this object just to show you how this works. So if I were to go to /API/users/posts, you can see that this endpoint works and it's nested inside the users folder. Okay, so that's, again, it works exactly like how our page route works. Okay, so what I can do is, let me just delete this posts.js file. I can create a dynamic route by simply using the square brackets, and inside the square brackets, we'll name the route parameter whatever we want. So I'll name it ID and then .js. Okay, and so let's just go ahead and get that handler function. Okay, right over here. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and define some users with an ID. So let's just do ID1, username Anson, 2, 3. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll set up a get request. And in the get request, what we want to do is we want to find the user based on its ID. Now, how do we get the ID? Well, like I said before, there is no request.params object on the request object itself, right? So if I try to go to this endpoint right over here, if I look in the console, you're going to see that it logs undefined when I try to reference rec.params. The correct property is rec.query, okay? Which I'm sure you're familiar with if you've used Express.js before. So if I go to that endpoint, if I visit that endpoint right now, you'll see that the ID is under the request.query object, okay? Now you're also probably wondering, well, what if we have query parameters, like actual query parameters, like something like, I don't know, sort by a desk, right? Those query parameters would be combined with the route parameters. Okay, so of course, as long as you don't have route parameters that conflict, like the name of the route parameter does not conflict with the actual query parameter, you should be okay. And I don't think you'll ever even run into the issue as well. Okay, but just wanted to mention that for those who might be a little bit confused. Okay, so yeah, so let's go ahead and simply do this. So we'll simply grab the let's grab the ID. Let's grab the ID from rec.query.id, and we need to make sure we parse it into an integer because the route parameter is by default going to be a string. So we need to parse it to an integer. Okay, and we actually don't even need to do this over here. Let me remove that. So what I'll do is I'll do this. I'll do const user equals users.find, and then we'll basically pass in the predicate function, and then we want to search for the user by its ID, so we'll do user.id equals, and then we'll parse the query .id property. Okay, so if the user is found, so we'll use a ternary operator, so return user if the user is found. So if user is defined, we'll do res.send user. If it's not found, we'll do res.status 404, and I'll just do send message not found. Okay, and then for the default case, for now we'll just say return res.status 405 send message method not allowed. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into Thunder Client. And this extension, by the way, you can install it in Visual Studio Code. It's free, of course. So let's go and get the user. So I can get user number 1, user number 2, or user of ID number 1, user of ID number 2. I can get user of ID number 3. If I pass in number 4, it's going to say not found. If I try to use a post request, it's going to say method not allowed. So that is how you can set up dynamic routes, right? Dynamic routes for your API. Okay, very similar to how you would set up dynamic route pages. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Okay, now one more thing that I will show you as well is let's say for example after the dynamic route ID, we want to also get a resource that belongs to the specific user based on its based on the user's ID, right? Because for example, typically with the API name convention. So for example, you can see over here I have /API/users. So the resource over here that we're accessing is users. After users, you typically want to, you typically would expect something like a user ID for the route parameter. So in this case, we're passing something like 2. Okay, so this represents a single user. But if you wanted to grab the user's let's say, for example, you wanted to grab the user's posts. Maybe you're working on some kind of blogging platform, and the user has a post, right? Your API route would look something like this, right? But how would we set up this route? Well, we know that this 2 is a dynamic route ID, and we know that after that route parameter, we have the posts endpoint, right? So what I can do is I can create a new folder, and I can actually name that folder square bracket ID like this. Okay, now what I can do is I can move this file into this folder right over here, and I can rename this to index.js. And this setup is equivalent to what we just had previously, where we had the square bracket ID index or square bracket ID.js, right? But what we're doing here is we're creating a folder inside the users folder called square bracket ID. And inside the square bracket ID, we have the index.js file. And basically, we can access the same endpoint, which will then invoke the function that's inside the index.js file. Okay? I know it might be a little bit confusing, but try to understand that if you have the index.js file, that basically represents the entry point to that route, if that makes sense. So having this index.js file is basically kind of like the default handler. Okay, so notice how the same behavior happens. And if I wanted the posts endpoint, I can set up post.js. Let me copy the handler. Okay, and of course, if we wanted to access the route parameter, we get that from rec.query, same thing. Okay, and what I'll just do for now is I'll just go ahead and just do res.send posts just for now. Okay, so let's take a look at how this endpoint works. So if I go to /API/users/ the ID of the user, so 2 /posts, it'll give me posts. If I look at the console, I can still access the route parameter ID of 2. Okay, pretty straightforward. Hopefully it makes sense. If you have any questions, definitely let me know down in the comments below. Okay, but hopefully you better understand how these routes work and how you can create more complex nested routes for your API. So that is going to be pretty much it for this whole Next.js tutorial. I really hope you all enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me on Twitter. Feel free to join my Discord server and ask for help, or you can just leave a comment down below. So anyways, that'll be all for this tutorial. I'll see you all later. Peace out.